Amanda. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. If you want to go ahead and open the slides, that would be great.
Are you not seeing
Great. So thank you so much for joining us today. So we are going to be looking at navigating loss and grief in foster and adoptive youth. And of course, this is a lunch and learn for Children's Bereavement Center. Right, you can go forward. So taking a quick look at what you can expect for today, there are a range of different approaches that are planned so that we can really dive into this topic. So you're going to learn more about the prevalence and disproportionality of foster care. We also have a video where you will get to hear some of the youth voices, as well as another video where we'll really be stepping into this topic of looking at the experience of foster care through a lens of looking at many different types of losses. You're also going to learn more about ambiguous and compounded losses. And if this is something that you're already familiar with, you might learn kind of a different way about looking at them. And then finally, we'll close with some strategies and some approaches for working with foster and adoptive youth. All right, go forward. And why don't we go ahead forward? I assume you all are familiar with the learning objectives. So just a piece about who I am so you can know more about my framework and my background. Initially, actually, before I came to this current role, I was in the state of Connecticut. And for about 10 years, I was working with foster youth. The youth who I worked with were in a range of different settings. So some of them were in residentials, group homes, foster homes, kinship care placements. So it really ran the gamut in terms of the different types of placement. My expertise and specialty was really informing a sense of an emotional sense of permanency. So really looking at how to support foster and adoptive youth and really exploring their identity, understanding more about their history, and also helping them to feel more connected and feel a greater sense of belonging in their life. I also, for about 4 years, was a clinician working with foster youth in a large nonprofit agency in Connecticut. And then for the past 10 years, I was able to come to the Children's Room, which is an independent bereavement center. We're located in Arlington, Massachusetts, but we serve schools and community-based agencies all over Eastern Massachusetts. And it's a bereavement center really focused on supporting children, teens, and families who have experienced the death of an immediate family member. A portion of my role is in supporting the schools and the community-based agencies. And this has included also groups in residentials working with foster youth, and also providing professional development for professionals, again, kind of really from the range of schools, agencies, etc. All right, you can go forward. So you know a little bit now about who I am and where I'm coming from. I'd like to learn a little bit more about all of you. So we're going to start off with a poll. All right, so if you take a look at question 1 there, what is your role? What is the lens you're coming from? We'll give it just a moment more. So it looks like we really have a range of bereavement support, therapists, administrators, social workers, and clinicians who are probably working directly with foster and adoptive youth, educators, and other, probably a range of different of roles. Whatever your profession that you're coming from, the likelihood is that you will interact with foster and adoptive youth at some point in time. And so I really welcome you to kind of take your own lens of your work and apply it to what you learned today and see kind of the pieces that you can take with you for whenever you might interact with foster and adoptive youth in the future. All right, the next poll. Oh, and sorry, there. Share the results so you can take a look who else is with you. All right. For the next one, is that one showing okay? Yes, Claire and Amanda? Can you all see it? No.
Oh, I see the first one here. Let me,
Okay, hang on one second.
let's,
I got it.
okay, got it.
That one. All right. There's the next question. So, have you worked with a foster or adoptive youth before? Yes, it's my primary focus. I've worked with many, I've worked with a few, or I have never worked with foster and adoptive youth. All right, so it looks like we're about even here in terms of experiences. A few more of you who have worked with many foster and adoptive youth, but really kind of the range, which is exciting actually for exploring this topic, because we'll all come from different approaches, and new eyes, as well as those of you who have had many experiences, will have some to be able to share with the rest of us as well. And then for the last one, have you ever worked with a foster or adoptive youth who has experienced a death loss? And there are many different types of relationships here. So it could be birth parent, birth sibling, foster parent, foster sibling, caregiver, or adoptive. All right, and it looks like for this one, a number of you who have worked with a youth who's experienced the death of a birth parent or birth sibling, and then just a few for foster parent, adoptive parent, and then many who have not. So this will be new information for some of you. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for participating in that and leaning in. I really want to invite you that whatever your experience is, really lead first with checking in with yourself, right? We all do this work and we all know the importance of making sure to lead with your own self-care, and making sure to take care of yourself, because these are big topics. I want to make sure the poll's not showing anymore, right? No, perfect. Okay. So these are big topics, and we want to make sure that you give yourself space to check in with what you need throughout this lunch and learn. So if you have a close connection, whether that's professionally or personally with a foster adoptive youth, maybe you have your own personal experience, maybe you know someone, again, maybe you work with those youth, just make sure to check in with yourself throughout this time and do whatever you need. So that might be, just taking a sip of water, just kind of pausing and taking a breath, or it could mean just checking in with yourself and saying, how am I feeling in this moment? And make space and time to really honor that. All right, you can step forward, Claire. All right. So we're going to start first with acknowledging bereavement and acknowledging the prevalence of this experience, because especially if your focus really is on working in the child welfare system, you might not have heard a lot about these numbers, and you might be surprised by just how common this experience is of experiencing the death of a close or immediate family member. So I'm going to let this video speak for itself as its first introduction.
Long overlooked, childhood bereavement is a critical issue nationwide. 1 in 12 children in the U.S. will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. Experiencing a significant loss during childhood often results in profound stress and adversity that can derail a child's development. However, providing appropriate support to a grieving child can ease the impact and help keep a child's development on track. Access to comprehensive, grief-focused, trauma-informed care and resources is necessary for the well-being of every bereaved child.
All right. So what you were seeing there is called the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. It's information that's updated and released each year from the JAG Institute, which is run by Judy's House in Aurora, Colorado. And we call it the CBEM for short. What the CBEM is looking at is the prevalence of this experience of the death of a parent or a sibling. So what we found nationwide is that it's projected that 1 in 12 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the time they turn 18. So what that means is over 6 million youth in the country will have this experience by the time they reach adulthood. And it's estimated that about 1,089 children in the US are newly bereaved each day. So it's really important to kind of step back and take that in terms of how common this experience is. You might be curious about why is it projecting forward in terms of by the age of 18. The reason for this is that it really speaks to the importance of making sure to have grief supportive practices and grief-informed care in place so that when a death loss does happen, suddenly all of you are equipped to be able to support these youth. And for today, we're really taking in and honing in and really focusing specifically on foster and adoptive youth and what happens when they experience a death loss, which is also a really common experience and important to acknowledge. Okay, you can go for it. And what this illustration is showing you is really the importance of having those protective factors in place, having grief-informed care in place. So what you see here, that like orange jagged line, is the disrupted development that can happen after a child or teen experiences the death of a family member. So it can include a range of different long-term consequences, mental health related. It affects their relationships, their connections with others. Academically, we see a huge impact over time in terms of tardiness in arriving to school, more frequent absences from school, difficulty with concentration, motivation, retaining information over time, being able to retrieve that information. So all of these pieces are stressors that can cause disrupted development. And when you put in grief care protective factors, you put in community members who are caring, who are grief informed, you put in positive role models, you give them coping skills and really help them to learn those coping skills and give them a sense of peer support, knowing that they belong with others, we can really counter this, right? So we can counter with those light blue arrows there to make sure that there are positive outcomes over time and that these youth have the best opportunities possible. Okay, you can go for it. So there are over 391,000 youth currently in the United States foster care system. So if you take a look at that green box there, that largest percentage, those are youth who are living in a foster home, a non-relative foster home. So these are youth who have been removed from their birth family and have moved into at least one home with a family who was brand new to them, most likely completely unfamiliar to them beforehand. If you look at that next largest box there, the kind of like dark orange, those are kinship care placements. So those are relatives or other familiar individuals who are licensed as foster parents and the youth are placed in their home. So it is a familiar person, most likely, not guaranteed, but most likely. And at the same time, there are all of those experiences of unpredictability of leaving their birth home and moving into a separate placement. If you look at that blue box, that next largest, those are youth who are residing in a group home or a residential setting, what we call congregate care. So what that means is that they're in a setting that doesn't involve a family, right? That's more institutionalized, structured, et cetera, in terms of having access to consistent mental health supports, and really being in a setting that's very different from a home setting. And then finally, that like yellowish goldenrod box there, those are pre-adoptive homes. Those homes where a youth is residing and is planned to have an adoption in the future. And look how small that is, right? Just 4% of those youth have that certainty and confidence for their future. All right, we can go forward.
Christine, we
Yeah.
had a question in the chat. Ingrid asked, does the 9% include DJJ?
DJJ. Juvenile Justice? Is that Department of Juvenile Justice? Is that the question?
Yes.
I'm assuming.
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure I'm getting the acronym correctly. I don't believe so. That's a really good question. This information is coming from the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Kids Count Data Center. So I don't believe so, but you would probably have to do a deep dive into that particular number to confirm. Yeah. To my knowledge, and anybody here who knows differently, please feel free to put in the chat. To my knowledge, I don't believe that juvenile justice is considered a child welfare placement. So I don't think it would be included in that count. But I definitely could be wrong about that. Yeah. It is an institution. You're absolutely correct. Yeah. But I don't know that it's a child welfare institution. So that's the question. Yeah. And like I said, you can take a deep dive into the numbers to confirm for sure. Yep. The good news here is that each year of the children who are exiting foster care, about half are being reunited with a parent or primary caretaker. So I want to name that as well, that is the positive, that there are different ways that youth can exit the foster care system. That could be through guardianship, which is legal but not permanent. That could be through adoption, which is a permanent legal process. That could be through reunification, or it could be that they age out. They're emancipated from the system when they turn 18. So about half of those youth who are leaving the foster care system are being reunified and reunited with a parent or primary caretaker. All right, so we're gonna go forward. I want to ask you all, I want to give you a little bit of time to explore on your own. So if you can take out a piece of paper, if you have something nearby. If not, you don't necessarily have to use that. You could probably kind of brainstorm in your mind if you don't have something. And if you have something to write or draw with, that would be great. And what I want you to do next is to imagine a child or teen. All right, so picture them in your head. You get to choose the age. Think about all of the different needs that they have in order to grow up safely, joyfully, supported. And I want you to think, I'm going to give you a little hint, concrete and abstractly. What would you wish for them to have? What is most important for them to have in order to grow up, again, with that joy and that sense of safety? And on your paper, you can write or you can draw, use words, symbols, whatever works best for you, and just take maybe a minute or two to jot down some ideas. Take maybe 30 seconds more. All right, if you want to start to come on back, and hopefully everyone can find their chat. Down at the bottom there, you have the symbol for chat. If you can go ahead and put in the chat, pick maybe, let's say 2 or 3 of your ideas and go ahead and put them in the chat. What did you wish for this child or teen? What did you want to give them? Stability and guidance, consistency, right? Yeah. A clean and safe environment. So the physical safety around them. Trust. Absolutely, hugely important for relationships and the ability, not just for current relationships, but future relationships. Consistency, structure, nurture and emotional support. So it's not just taking care of your physical needs, but also your emotional needs. Unconditional love. This is hugely important for kids, right? To know that I can make mistakes and I can learn from those mistakes and I'll still be accepted. Role models, people to look up to, love, security, joy, something that gives them hope, right? Something that brings them joy and happiness, a feeling of belonging, understanding, feeling that if they express themselves, other people will understand and respect and validate what they say. A sense of self. Who am I? How do I understand myself, right? Someone to be present for them during grief and loss, to be able to hold those hard times. Yeah, this says actually hold over an umbrella over their rainy days. Absolutely, because it's important for kids to understand that these hard times are going to happen and people will be there to support them throughout it. It gives them that sense of resilience too, to know that they can manage whatever comes their way in life. Wonderful. High expectations, people who believe in them, who believe they have potential. Great. Yeah, an overall sense that the future can and will be positive. These are wonderful ideas. Thank you all so much. So I want you to take all of these ideas that we've imagined kind of collectively. And again, we have things that are like very tangible and concrete. And then we also have things that are more abstract, things that are current, as well as things for the future. Now I want you to imagine that youth who you pictured, someone incredibly important to them, maybe someone in their immediate family, someone has died, someone who they leaned on, who they expected to be there in their future, or at least hoped to have there in their future, even if they weren't currently. Yeah. Now imagine that on top of that, maybe because of the death loss, maybe not, maybe were already in care. Now imagine that youth is also in the child welfare system. They might be living in a completely new place, so that sense of safety, security, all of that is shaken up, new people. And how does it affect how they see themselves, right? So these are all the things that we're going to explore. Because what I found when I do this experiential and different trainings is that I have yet to find anything on these lists that can be named that might not be shaken, right? And disrupted by this experience of death loss, bereavement, as well as the experience of being in foster care or being adopted. Okay, you can go forward. So we're going to take a look now at a video that's going to let you really kind of connect with the emotions of that can happen for many foster youth. What I want you to do as you watch this video is pay close attention to different types of losses that this youth experiences, okay? So if you want to even jot them down on a piece of paper, feel free. That would be great, because we're going to bring them back all together afterwards. right, so let's go back into the chat. What were some of the losses that you noticed? What did this youth growing up in the system, what did they experience? Sibling separation, yeah. That close relationship that comes right from the very beginning, right? That severed. Multiple homes, schools, so many different schools, which brings that sense of belonging, right? As well as predictability, consistency. And it's not just about the schools, it's also about the peers, it's about the teachers who work with them every single day, connections. Yeah, did this youth feel safe moment to moment where they were? The relationships, the community around him was constantly changing. The home, stability. The foster parent, right? Some of those foster parents probably had a close connection with that youth and were also valued greatly. Yeah, broken bonds. College, those hopes for the future that you all spoke of. Loss of faith that the world is stable. Yeah, that childhood kind of innocence and hope that we really long to see for youth, that belief that adults can be stable and consistent, and the faith in that has been shaken. Trust, financial loss, uncertainty, fear. Yeah. Great job. So hold on to all these different experiences for this youth, and all the many changes that he wrote throughout the video. And I want to name this video really comes from a hopeful place also, right? That this was a video that was created many years ago by an agency, an organization that would create tutors and mentors and send out care packages and that sort of thing. So there is also the hopeful piece too, that these youth matter for all of us, right? If we can just care enough and we can find ways to connect. All right, you can go forward. So we're gonna look again at some of the risk factors for foster and adoptive youth. Some of these were named in the video, and many of them carry out over time, right? So temporary specific relationships with paid professionals. That's a really important piece that many people who work with foster youth will hear directly from the youth, that youth will even challenge some of the professionals in their life and say, yeah, you're great and all, you're nice, but like, you're here because it's your job, right? They're aware of that. So that unconditional piece, they recognize that it's not necessarily there, and that it actually can be disconnected with time, that if somebody switches jobs, those professionals, yes, they might have been important to them and connected with them, absolutely, and they're not a guarantee for that long-term future, right? And people who are obligated, committed to be a part of their life. Multiple disruptions, that continuity of care, how am I raised? Is that continuous over time? You can go forward. Rejection for behaviors and conditional acceptance. So that sense of, oh my goodness, all these different moves that have happened, all these different relationships, was that somehow on me? Is that somehow a judgment on who I am? Why did this even happen? Why did I move from place to place? Who can I attach to over time? You can go forward. There's also an assumption, the older that the youth become, there's an assumption that foster youth in particular are really striving for and yearning for that individuation. And yes, that's an important hallmark of adolescence, absolutely. We want to be developmentally informed. And we also want to recognize that for foster youth, they might actually be more focused on that attachment connection piece. They might be yearning for that even more so than the individuation piece. And sometimes we can lean so much towards that side of giving them their own space, letting them become responsible, independent, that we can inadvertently give them the message that they don't still need those attachments and connections over time. And their sense of identity. Who am I? That's difficult when you're not connected, possibly, with your birth family and not living with them and a part of their culture and community day to day, and understanding the stories of your family that you came from. And moving from place to place, it can shift that sense of identity, both internal as well as external. So how do I see myself, as well as how do I see myself in relation to others, including that bigger cultural piece, right? And all of these factors can lead to foster youth saying, you know what, I'm not sure that it's safe to ask for support or accept support, because sure if you're time, I'm not sure if I show my true self, I'm not sure what that's going to mean in the future in terms of will that be used in a beneficial way? Will that be understood in a positive way? Yeah, so that vulnerability can be really, really difficult. Okay, go for it. So we're taking a look now at some of the compounded losses, and we've actually already been stepping into them, I guess I'll name some of the compounded losses that foster and adoptive youth can experience. So in the center there, in that purplish bubble, you see the primary loss. For our work, you know, Children's Bereavement Center, in my center, the Children's Room, other bereavement agencies, oftentimes that primary loss that we're thinking about is a death loss. And it could be a death loss also, I'll name, for foster and adoptive youth. And at the same time, we always want to be aware that one of the really important pieces of grief-informed practice is understanding that the individual is the one who has the most accurate lens on what is a primary loss versus a secondary loss. So what feels most acute and significant in the moment, in that particular day, as well as over time. So there can be many different primary losses, not just one. Oftentimes people really simplify it down to just one primary loss that they see on the surface, and they forget to connect with the youth and check in with them about, hey, what's feeling most significant? What's affecting you the most? So that primary loss there is that youth identification of what feels most significant and impactful to them at that time in terms of a type of loss. And then what you see around it are kind of ripples in a pond, right? These are secondary losses that can stem off from this primary loss. So when you think about for foster and adoptive youth in general, we've seen some of these secondary losses, right? That there's the lack of connection, breaking off that connection from the birth parent. There's that sense of stability being shaken up. There's their home that they came from, literally the home itself, the place where maybe they felt safe. That's important to acknowledge that, you know, sometimes we know the history that comes with the child welfare system and all of that history that we've been told and our own perceptions of what is or is not safe. And at the same time, there might have been pieces of that home that for that youth really did feel safe, really did bring a sense of belonging. So we want to check in and acknowledge for them that they might have different perspectives of what feels safe and consistent and most important. Their dreams for the future, right? All of those pieces that all of you named, that the way that they look at the future has rippled out, has changed, the peers, the classmates, all of those relationships. Now, think about layering on top for a foster or adoptive youth who's also experienced a death loss. They have the person who died. They also have an added awareness of just how unpredictable life is. That's something that many foster and adoptive youth obviously come with because they've had that experience of life abruptly changing quite often. Now that's really magnified because it's also a death loss, and that's a loss that's permanent, right? That's lasting over time, which even that has a lot of differences from a loss that might feel more temporary, such as a removal from a home, or they might still have hope of being reunified, which is something we're going to explore a little bit more in a little bit when we talk about ambiguous loss. They also might have even more difficulties being able to express their emotions because that grief that they've experienced is so big and such a mix of emotions, such a jumble of emotions that are intertwined in terms of, you know, possibly like love and affection for the person who died, as well as the conflicted feelings of what caused them into to being a child who's in care, who's in foster care, as well as all of those mix of emotions of why did this happen and who decided that. So it could be a jumble of anger and confusion there, right? Anxiety over what's going to happen in the future. So with all these different emotions, it can be so great that sometimes that grief is, again, even more magnified and even more difficult to express. It might be challenging for them to really put a finger on, kind of the sources of their grief and really identifying what their emotions are and why, because they have so many different losses that are compounded. And then finally, for foster and adoptive youth, in comparison to other kids who experience a death loss, they have less consistent support, quite possibly, right? So that's a big difference that we might see between some of the other youth we're working with who have experienced a death loss in comparison to foster and adoptive youth, who might not even have a connection to the people who have the stories of the person who died. And that's a big, big piece of bereavement work, is being able to tell stories about the person who died. Can they share those stories? Do they even know those stories? Okay, you can go for it. So I mentioned that a significant piece of my earlier career was working with foster youth, and it was a program that was youth driven. So we really looked to the youth to identify what are the things you want to know about your life. What's the information that you would like to have? What are the connections that you would like to help form in the future? And so I worked with a youth who I call Josie, and these were some of her questions that she identified that she wanted help in understanding. So who named me, right? How did they choose my name? When I was born, who was there? Who greeted me? Who came and saw me in the hospital? Who welcomed me home? What was I wearing? What's my birth story? That's such a basic origin story, right? That's shared. And for many foster and adoptive youth, they might not have that story, or they might have heard it in a distant past, and they really yearn to hear it again and to hear some more of the details they never got to ask. Did I have a childhood nickname? What were my favorite treats, favorite foods? Did my family go to, church, cathedral, synagogue, etc.? What was our religious background of my family? Where did we go? What communities did we belong to is really what that question is asking, right? As well as beliefs. What beliefs was I raised with? What was my relationship like with my brother? This particular youth had been separated from her brother for so many years that she barely had any semblance of her own current relationship with him, her own sense of identity in terms of what it meant to be siblings. And she really wanted to know, when we were young, what did that relationship look like? What were the things we did together? And then finally, very forward-facing, especially when you think about a teen, she wanted to know, are there any family medical conditions that I should know about? So think about that, right? Even as adults, we go to the doctor, they ask about our family history. Some youth have to say, I don't know that. So these are some of the actual questions that were asked. And I would really say that these are all secondary losses, that she didn't know these answers to some questions that many youth take for granted. Many people do as they're growing up. Okay, go for it. So when a youth enters the foster care system, however brief, life can get complicated. They might have felt like I had that straightforward story that was easy to explain to others, at least on the surface. And life just got a whole lot more complicated for me to understand, much less for me to share with others. Okay, you can go for it. So there are many different layers to grief for foster and adoptive youth. And what we're taking a look at here is that so often our focus is on that particular child or teen, right? And thinking about their grief. And sometimes we forget there are many other individuals who are also impacted and are also grieving. So there's obviously also the birth parents and what it means for them to know that they have a child out there in the world who's not residing with them. So that can bring up lots of questions for them. They may be grieving that child's absence. They may also be grieving that sense of their own identity of being a birth parent. The foster and adoptive parents, they are also oftentimes grieving because they see that child's pain, they see that child's grief in front of them, and so they're holding some of that pain themselves and witnessing that and not being able to change it or take it away, which is actually what we advise and recommend in the field, that you don't want to take away the pain. You want to let them experience their own story and hold their own pain. And it can be hard, right, to be that foster or adoptive parent who's there every single day and witnessing that, as well as sometimes society doesn't understand their relationship, doesn't value their relationship as closely as they do birth family. The siblings, both the siblings who are separated, as well as, again, the siblings who are there in the day-to-day, for foster and adoptive siblings, that's a big change in their life. And that can be positive. That can be something that they find joy in. And at the same time, it's a change. And any big change brings some layers of loss and grief. The relatives of the birth parents, all of those extended family who are out there and say, I don't know what happened to this youth, quite possibly. What I heard from many birth parents was, or birth family, I'm sorry, is that they oftentimes didn't even know what happened to a child and why. Sometimes they didn't know how to locate them. Or maybe they did. Maybe the social workers did an amazing job of connecting with them and finding all of that extended family, and maybe they weren't able to have that youth come live with them for whatever reason. And imagine some of the grief in that as well, of knowing that there's family out there who I actually can't help, or had to make the decision that I didn't feel able to help in this time. And then the community, the peers, think about all those schools that youth was in that video. That youth knew other kids. And those other kids, when that youth moves to another placement, possibly switches schools, those youth might be wondering, what happened to them? That was my friend. And then finally, I really want to acknowledge the providers, the people who work with these youth. Again, witness the challenges, witness the pain, hold a lot of it, sometimes get the emotions put onto them for certain, and have to hold space for that. And again, the accountability of not being able to take it away necessarily, just really holding space and witnessing it. Okay, you can go for it. So we're going to take a look now at a concept called ambiguous loss, which you might or might not have heard of, depending on your role and familiarity with the bereavement field. And I'm really taking a look at it regardless in a different lens, in terms of really looking at it through the eyes of a foster or adoptive youth. And what I'm going to name is that these youth really quite possibly tap into all three different types of ambiguous loss. So that first one there that you see up top is that the family member is still alive. They might even be physically present, but the child or teen feels an emotional sense of absence. So this can come before the youth comes into care, when they've experienced abuse or neglect, potentially. Then they might have had this experience of my caregiver is right in front of me, but they're not able to be present with me. For children who have witnessed caregivers who had challenges with their mental health, or were really struggling with substance abuse and addiction, they might have had this experience again of, my caregiver is there, but something's different. They're not as present with me, quite possibly. And sometimes it can be difficult even to pinpoint when that loss occurred, right? So that's the ambiguous nature of it. I would also say that when foster youth have visits with birth family, and they have some of those pieces of, yes, they're here with me, and the relationship feels different during those visits. It doesn't feel as natural. That is a sense of ambiguous loss right there. The second one there that you see is really bolded because it's really common to the majority of foster or adoptive youth. So the family member is not currently in their life, but the child or teen wonders whether they might be in the future. So this can really overlap with when there's a separation, when there's divorce, when a youth comes into foster care or adoption and they're separated from that birth family. It's really common to have fantasies of, will I see them again? at some point in the future. Foster youth oftentimes identify that they can imagine like bumping into the person in the street. They kind of envision it in their heads. They wonder, will I be reunified? Will I be able to go back and live with them again? So that's really a sense of ambiguous loss right there. It's also true of adoption, I want to name, even though there is that permanency, that legal standpoint, that legal framework of I'm in a home where I belong and it's stable, there can still be that sense of ambiguous loss of, could I get more information about my birth family? You know, and again, that fantasizing of what if I ran into them one day and didn't even know it? Would I recognize them? Would they recognize me? And then that third category there is when a death loss has happened, or actually other types of losses as well, there can be parts of the story that are unclear or unknown. So for foster and adoptive youth, that's often really a prevailing experience of feeling like there are parts of my story that I don't understand. I don't even know for certain how I ended up in this situation of being in the system. Even if they were given information, sometimes they're skeptical and wondering, was I given the full story? Whose story was that? You know, whose perception and perspective was that? Oftentimes also when they move from one placement to another, there's that sense of, why did this happen? Why did I move from one place to another? When somebody has died also, foster and adoptive youth oftentimes are missing many gaps of that story. So sometimes they're finding out after the fact that the person died, and there can be that sense of kind of disownment of feeling like, I'm a part of the family still. Shouldn't I have been able to know as soon as this happened? And it's oftentimes unintentional that they don't know right away. And regardless, when they do find out, there can be that sense of, I wish I'd been able to know right up front. Or maybe they go to the services, but they don't feel like they belong in the same way with the people who are there, with the extended family. So they might feel a little bit of distance, even if they're included and able to be there at the services. So there can be many unknowns after a person has died. Memory objects, we, in our group that we ran in a residential, in a group home, one of the youth specifically says over and over again, I don't have anything that belonged to my dad. And that's something that even other kids in this grief group have, and I don't have. I wish I had his sweatshirt. I wish I had something that belonged to him. And sometimes that can be lost after there's a death loss. Okay, you can go for it. All right, so we're gonna take a look at a case scenario now. What I want you to think about is, what are some of the primary losses? So what would you identify as those really concrete, apparent losses that would go in that center bubble? And then what are some of the underlying layers of loss, some of those secondary ripples? They're more abstract, ambiguous, and secondary. Okay, you can go for it. And I'll read it out loud for anyone that's easier for. If you prefer to read it, you can do that too, whatever fits best for you. All right, so imagine a preteen, a 12-year-old, who was removed from her birth mother's home when she was 8 years old due to allegations of abuse and substance misuse. Her father was never involved in her life. She has lived in multiple placements over the course of the past 4 years, including several hospitalizations. For the past 6 months, she's been living in a group home. For the first 3 years after entering the foster care system, her mother was intermittently involved in her life. Now, for the past year, their contact became more consistent, and they have begun having weekly unsupervised visits. After the mother misses a visit, the DCF worker learns from extended family that she recently died of sudden, unknown causes. All right, so what would you say, first of all, the primary? What would you name as the primary loss? You can go ahead and put it in the chat, or losses, I should say. What stands out to you most immediately? Yeah, the removal from her mother, loss of both parents, right? And one is that ambiguous loss. Her father, who was never involved in her life, might still be out there somewhere. And one is her mother's death. Yeah, feeling of abandonment, conflicted feelings. And let's think about some of those secondary losses. So what are some of those underlying, some of those ripples that you see? Think back to those bubbles, multiple placements. What's within those multiple placements? What can you all identify? Hospitalization, yeah, the stigma of hospitalization too, I would name. Communal care rather than primary caregiver. So what does it mean to live in a congregate care setting? Yeah, a group home, which you know is intended to be short term, right? And has staff who are coming in and out. A sense of rejection. Yeah. Yeah, I would say there's also all of the ambiguous loss from before she came into care, right? Of what she experienced with her mom, loss of stability and trust. So she had a mixed relationship with her mom. She really did, because her mom was inconsistent for multiple years. And so when her mom came back into her life on a consistent basis, she held the both and, is what we call in our work, right? That sense of, wow, she's come back and she's really trying and she's there for me and she cares. And the and of what's going to happen in the future. No one to really turn to. Loss of knowledge of family of origin. Yeah. So if you think about it, she was 8 years old when she entered the system. She didn't have that big picture thinking that she now does as a preteen, being able to understand her family in a greater way. Yeah, that opportunity cost. So I kind of think of it as like, youth are really into right now, like alternate universes. And I think that's how a lot of you think of it. Like in an alternate world where I wasn't removed from my mom's care, who am I in comparison to who I am now? Great. All right, why don't we go forward? So I want to make sure to acknowledge diversity. It's really important in terms of identity and how it impacts grief-related experiences. So diversity, that sense of who you are, where you come from, how you see yourself, your culture, your race, etc. All of that affects your experience of grief. So in the midst of your grief, how do you experience it? How do you understand it? Do you feel supported during the midst of it, right? How you express your grief is the other piece. So your identity affects, like, do you feel like it's okay to express your grief? And what's your natural inclination? Are you somebody who holds it inside internally? Are you somebody who works through it through like music or art, for example? Maybe that's something you've seen in your upbringing as a way to express your grief. Or are you someone who connects with others to hold your grief? And what do you view as socially acceptable ways to grieve? So is it okay to show your emotions outwardly? Is it okay to be, a big boisterous show of emotions? Or is it okay to cry? Is it okay to yell and scream? Or should you kind of hold that inside? Should you do that one-on-one? Who are the supports you can turn to? So is it okay to show who you really are? Or are you guided more to like hold that for your family, which is what some families do value, but now you're severed from that family. So what does that mean? Who do you now turn to? Can you accept supports or not? And for youth in the system, this idea of socially acceptable ways to grieve, it's really a big piece for them, that they've been exposed to multiple different communities quite often, different settings. So they might have gotten different guidances and modeling in ways to grieve. At the same time, hopefully, they're getting a lot of counseling support, right? And a lot of encouragement to be able to share their emotions openly. But in the midst of that, what are they feeling inside? Do they feel like, is this what I've seen growing up? Is this really okay? And then think about all of those trust pieces that we named earlier. So specifically, is it okay to trust you, to share my emotions, to share my grief? I do want to name that, what my experience was that I saw with many foster youth, that grief was something that was very carefully held, because we do want to be aware of the emotions for foster youth, and we do want to be aware of everything they've experienced, and do want to be aware of, sometimes how vulnerable they can be on an emotional level. And at the same time, their grief is a part of their story, right? And so we have to really be cautious about that, to make sure that we make space for their grief, and let them know that we can hold that pain, we can hold their stories. But that's not always the experience foster youth have, especially if you think about if their grief is expressed through outbursts, for example, right? Big emotions. How is that interpreted by the adults who are around them? Is that interpreted as a common grief response? Or is that seen as like a mental health concerns, or a fragility, or something that we need to be more guarded about? So it's important to keep in mind that we want to make sure to give that messaging that it's okay to share your grief. And we always want to make sure, if you're an educator, provider, et cetera, when you're working with youth, you want to check in with yourself to say, is this a common grief experience? Is this a common grief response? Either because of a death loss, or because grief is kind of layered throughout these experiences of being in the foster care system. You can go for it. So we're going to take a look now at some of the disproportionality for youth in the foster care system. So what you see here is that certain races are overrepresented in the foster care system. So Black youth comprise more than 1 in 5 foster youth. All right, so that's about 22%. By comparison, if you look at the national demographics, they make up 14% of the total child population. So 14% compared to 22%. It's really staggered. The positive note is that we are seeing that with each year progressively, the share of children who are Black in foster care, it's been going down. It's the lowest that it's been in 2 decades. So that is progress, and that is encouraging. There are many factors underneath all of this, though, right? In terms of how do we see certain families, how are different families received and supported, and what supports do they have access to in their communities, what resources, et cetera. That's a whole piece that we could spend a long time talking about. And it's really important to acknowledge, right, that there is a disproportionality in terms of the likelihood that youth will be taken into the system, as well as how long they will stay in the system. By contrast, underrepresented, so white children make up more than 2 in 5 kids in care, so about 43%. But if you compare to the total child population, they're about 49% of the total child population. So again, there are fewer disproportionate, there are fewer white youth who are in the foster care system compared to the general population of the country. For Hispanic or Latino kids, they make up more than 1 in 5 in comparison to 26% nationwide. So it's 22% versus 26%. Not quite as uneven, but still just a little bit. Okay, you can go forward. There's also a disproportionality for foster youth of identifying as LGBTQ and the experiences that they have while they're in the system. So when they've surveyed LGBTQ youth ages 13 to 24, so we're thinking about teens and young adults, about 4% have identified being in the foster care system. By comparison, if we looked at the general population, it would be 2.6%. So there's much more likelihood that these youth who identify in this way, that they're more likely to have had experiences of being in the system. In addition, if you really want to layer on top as well, when we look at youth in the system, and then we look at youth in the system who identify as LGBTQ, Many of them are people of color, are youth of color. So that's important to acknowledge because it's kind of those double pieces of stigma, right? In terms of experiences where they might not feel as supported in terms of their race or might be more likely to be in the system. And now they're doubly more likely to be in the system in terms of having that identity. And I think just as importantly, we want to acknowledge that for foster youth who identify as transgender and non-binary, 40% reported that they felt like they had a placement disruption because of their identity. So their perception was that because of their identity, something happened and they ended up having to move from one place to another. So that's really important in terms of that experience of rejection, right? And am I accepted? Do I belong? Do people understand who I am and validate and support me? And then finally, those youth are also, they have a 3 times greater likelihood of having a suicide attempt. So when we look at specifically transgender youth in the foster care system, much more vulnerable for suicidal ideation. Okay, can go forward. So kind of underwriting many different pieces of this is this concept of disenfranchised grief. So this is a model and framework that came from a researcher named Ken Doka. And Ken really identified 3 different types of disenfranchised grief. For the sake of time and simplicity, we've divided it into 2. So on the left here are different types of relationships that the youth might have had with the person who died. And the youth might feel like their relationship with that person is undervalued or not supported, or even more than that, is actually judged. So included within that side is the relationship with the foster or adoptive parent, the relationship with the birth parent too. So if the person who died was one of those relationships, oftentimes people don't recognize the importance of that death loss to as great as a degree as they may, another child, another youth experience. So what that affects is, do those youth feel like it's okay to acknowledge the death loss when it happens, to talk about it openly, to share their grief or not? Or do they feel like if they share about their grief, it's going to be minimized? Or that people are even going to make assumptions about the person who died? If you think about like a birth parent, for example, and that death loss happens, maybe think about that youth in that case scenario that we had. Would she feel like it was okay to share about her mom's death? Would people make assumptions about how her mom died? Because it's actually unknown at that point in time exactly how she had died. So would people assume what the cause of death was? Would people say like, oh, well, you weren't living with her at this point anyway? Would people really encourage her, let's just focus on your current relationships? Let's focus on who is there without holding space for her mom no longer being in her life. And then on the right side here, what we have are different causes of death that can bring up stigma, judgment, and assumptions. So these are different causes of death that if the cause of death is known, people oftentimes will make an assumption about what that means about the person who died. And also on top of that, what that means for the person who's grieving is that they might feel like, again, it's not okay to share openly about the death loss. I want to put in a quick little moment in case you haven't heard this before. It's really, really important in terms of the importance of language when we're working with these youth. So when you think about how you talk about different causes of death, oftentimes the easiest point is to think about if somebody died from cancer, how would you say it, right? That's exactly how you would say it. You would say they died from cancer. Now take that phrase and you should be able to insert any of the other causes of death into that phrase. If you're saying it differently, like, common phrases used to be committed suicide, for example, those kinds of phrases can put on top of it shame and blame, both towards the person who died as well as to the surviving family members. So that's really important. But what I also want to acknowledge is that you might respond to these youth differently depending on what you learn about how the person who died. It's kind of a natural inclination that sometimes when there's a story that feels a little bit harder to us, a little bit harder to talk about, sometimes people pull back from holding that grief. So you always want to check in with yourself about, am I leaning in to this youth's grief and how they share about it, or am I pulling back? And why? And does it connect to pieces on either side of their relationship with that person or how they died? What I would say is most important is really to follow the youth's lead, right? And even if it's a really tough story, and yes, we want to protect these youth, we really need to follow their lead and how they understand what's happened, how they choose to remember that person who died. Okay, you can go ahead. This is circling back to the childhood bereavement estimation model. And what you're seeing here, first of all, prevalence is on the rise. I want to make sure to name that, both state levels as well as nationally, that prevalence of experiencing a death loss as a child or teen is becoming more likely. What you see on the right side there are different causes of death. So the gray boxes there are many of the causes of death that people most commonly initially think of, right? People think of cancer, they think of heart disease, they think of accidents, etc. On the right side there are what oftentimes are considered to be stigmatized causes of death. So thinking about, overdoses, if you have a youth who the death loss occurred in the midst of the pandemic, and I will name COVID can still play a part in some causes of death even now, in terms of compounded medical factors. When you think about suicide, when you think about homicide. So all of those are on that right side there. And these are all stigmatized, disenfranchised losses quite often. It does depend on the perspective of the person who's grieving. So this right side, these are all death losses that, first of all, we're seeing many of them on the rise and contributing towards that prevalence. But even more importantly, 50% are causes of death that are hard to talk about. And if they're hard for us to talk about and think about it for these youth who sometimes it might be difficult for them to understand exactly what's happened, especially if there are pieces of that story that they don't know, especially if the adults in their life haven't shared openly with them about it. Okay, you can go for it. All right, so we're gonna take a look here. I wanna leave a little bit of space for the youth to be able to share their own voices. This is a video called Adoptive Speak, where you're gonna be able to hear from a few youth who have been adopted, and they're sharing about, particularly in light of race, what their experience of adoption has been like.
I'm with my mother, Jana. She's a single mother to me, and we're a interracial family.
Is she Caucasian?
Yes, foster to adopt. I've been with her about 3 years now. When you see an African American that's like big with this middle-aged 54-year-old like 5'4" lady, Caucasian, and if you don't know who we really are, then you're just gonna think that I'm trying to take something from her.
What would you like to say to the people who see you, a 6 foot buff black guy and a petite Caucasian, your mom? What would be something you'd like to share as you get these stares and people wondering?
Well, when they stare at me, I kind of stare at them back, just showing them that yes, this is what's happening. Deal with it. It's 2015. Things are changing.
The look of a modern family.
Yeah, like we're not different than who you are, and you're not different than who we are.
People have challenged, my blackness based on the fact that both of my parents are white.
So I feel like you're kind of in the middle, that you're playing kind of on both sides.
Right.
You're protecting your parents and their identity and who they are, but then you're also protecting your own racial identity.
Yeah.
That's a unique space to be.
Yeah.
When people ask me about why I don't look like my parents at school, I tell them I'm adopted and they ask more questions and it just feels really awkward.
Does it feel awkward to answer all their questions, or what about it feels awkward?
Trying to like explain like when they ask like, oh, do you know your birth mother, or have you ever met any of your siblings or anything? It's like, it's just like uncomfortable, I guess.
Does it feel like it's really private information?
Yeah.
I'm Black, I'm African American, that's how I identify. And until about a half a year ago, that's what I thought I was. I thought that I was fully African American. But after speaking with my sibling, who still, I mean, she's, you know, she has her own child now and everything, but she, you know, she grew up with my birth mother, and she was saying that we might not be fully Black, and we don't know. And this is, of course, both for me, the struggles that many African Americans face not knowing your entire history, intertwined with being adopted and not knowing, you know, my own immediate family's history. But I'm taking genetics tests, and I haven't gotten results yet because I sort of wanted to wait for school to be over.
Does it feel threatening to not be fully Black?
I don't know if that's what's threatening. It's just, I guess, I've never felt really uncertain about any aspect of my identity. Like I've always been confident in my sexual orientation, my gender identity, my racial identity, you know, all of that. Like I knew I was a straight, cisgender, Black male. So this is sort of the first time I've ever been challenged in an identity that's not strictly adoption, that's not questions that tend to, you know, perplex a lot of adopted youth and adults.
All right, so let's go back to the chat. What were some of the themes that stood out to you all, or quotes? What were some of the things that felt vulnerable or challenging for these youth? Yeah, identity and the privacy of identity, other people and their assumptions, their questions, right? And people thinking it's their right to ask questions, to be quite frank. Yeah. Searching for identity. Who am I? In many, many different ways. Looking different from their adoptive parents. How does that feel for them? As well as, again, how does the world see them and understand them? One of those youth is like, hey, deal with it. He clearly feels comfortable with it for his own life. And at the same time, probably on guard, you know, aware of how other people might be responding. Society's views and opinions, blended families. Not knowing, big questions. Yeah. Yeah, people coming up and asking questions directly. And think about the implications of that question of, you know, is she yours? What does that feel like? And what are the implications? And why, first of all, why is it your business? But then second of all, why does it matter? What does that mean in terms of how you see us and our connections and our relationships and valuing those, respecting those? Not knowing my own family history. Yeah. Not knowing both the immediate family history as well as like ancestry, right? Going way back. And I think tied into that, again, culture and community. What culture, what community do I identify with? Do I belong to? Yeah, and unintended ignorance. I think this is something that you hear from a lot of youth, that they're like, people don't mean to be insensitive. They don't even realize what they're saying. Yeah, thank you. All right, so we're gonna go forward. I wanna name for these last 10 minutes. Feel free to go ahead and put things in the chat if you have any questions. I want to make sure to build in time, but I also want to make sure to offer some strategies and approaches. I also want to offer this piece, the shift here of acknowledging that for all youth, but especially actually it's proven for foster and adoptive youth, a relationship with a responsible and caring adult is the highest protective factor for them long term, right? So all it takes is one. And you never know who that person might be. And it can be somebody, even, I encourage you to look up a poem I used to use with foster youth called Reason, Season, or Lifetime. And we would talk about this. We would talk about with the youth of, hey, there are some relationships that were there for a reason, a short time period. And there are some relationships that were there for a season, for a little bit longer. And for whatever reason, they couldn't be there long term. But it was natural. They cared about you, you know? And then the lifetime, who are the people who you really want there into the future? So wherever your relationship with the youth fits, there is a hope, you know, a positive in that, a strength. Okay, you can go for it. When you have a foster youth who experiences a death loss, I wanted to name some pieces that will help empower them. So if you're working with a youth and this happens, that they're in care and then a death loss occurs, most importantly, try to empower them. Involve them as much as you can in the process. Come and share the information with them as honestly as you can and follow their lead. Find out what questions they have. What else would they like to know? What do they feel like will be most supportive for them? Do they want everybody to know? Do they want a lot of different people to know so that they don't have to share that information themselves? Or do they only want certain people who really, really need that information to know? And what pieces of the information, what pieces of the story do they want shared out as well? So it's really important to check in with the youth about all these different things, all these different considerations, because when they first gotten the information that a death has occurred, they're just, you know, they're numb and the shock is kind of setting in. And they might not think of all these different implications. And also really yourself, as well as the other people who are supporting this youth, help everyone involved to anticipate emotions are going to happen. And we might not see them initially, they will happen over time. And it might be 3 months, 6 months, a year from now or more, but we want to be able to hold space for those emotions so that the youth know that they can be safe in sharing those, and really trust themselves too, to be able to grieve their losses. Be flexible with the youth. So give them options. At the same time, I'm going to say that structure is also really important. And that's something that you can really support their caregivers in understanding as well. That we want to make sure to hold some stability for them as well, some consistency, because these youth really do lean into that. So again, what that can mean is giving them options, giving them choices, right? Rather than just a free-for-all, you want to make sure to do it in a safe and supportive way. Okay, you can go forward. Some ways that you can prepare for difficult days. So anniversaries that come around, their person's birthday, or even just the day-to-day, you know, maybe a season reminds them of their person. Either reminds them of when they first came into the foster care system, or reminds them of when a person has died. There are different ways to really hold on to those connections. So food, the importance of food. What were the foods they remember that they really loved in the past places that they have lived? Maybe you help them out with learning how to cook those. Go seek out a restaurant that makes that particular food that they remember. Visiting special places. So again, what are the places where you felt moments of joy in the past that you can connect? Let's go visit those places. You can share those stories. We can do the activities that remind you of your person. Make sure just to talk about them, you know, leave them the choice, leave that space that they can talk about them whenever they want to, when they feel ready. Maybe there's a song that reminds them of their person. That can be incredibly powerful to listen to it together. Look at photos or videos together, right? Or write a letter, which is something we'll explore in a moment. Okay, you can go forward. So we're going to take a look at these different approaches and techniques through the frameworks of grief models. So this first one is called the dual process model. I'm going to give very brief pieces about each of those models. If you're not familiar, I encourage you to go explore them further. The dual process model is about holding the both and. It's about leaving space for the loss orientation, for the grief, as well as for the restoration orientation, which is about forming new relationships, right? Finding things that also bring joy. And it's also about that in between. So that's what that line in between means, that we expect to see in grief. We expect to see that both and, going back and forth between the grief as well as the future relationships. activities, etc. Okay, so if you can go forward. One of these approaches that you can do is a mask of emotions. You might have seen this activity used in different ways. Really allowing them to hold space for what goes on the inside, what are their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, and then on the outside, what do they show to others? It's a great way to also explore, like, how do they experience grief in comparison to what do they show others? What do they feel safe to share to others in comparison to what they hold inside? And you can do words, phrases, memories, etc. too, so they can write, draw, symbols, colors. Okay, you can go forward. Another one we use is footprints, where we have like a cutout of a footprint and it's double-sided. And on one side is where I've been. So what are all the different places and relationships and emotions that they've had in the past? What supported them? And then where am I going? So what do I value most now as well as in the future? Who do I want to have there in the future? What are the coping skills that have helped me, right? What are the ways that I can keep honoring and connecting with the people from my past? Okay, you can go for it. This other model is called growing around grief. So it's the idea that your grief, instead of shrinking in size like you see in those top bottles, instead your grief is consistent. It's a part of your story, but what grows is your experiences and your understanding of your grief. Okay, you can go forward. And so you can make a lifeline of loss. On one side, they can put all of their connections, all of the people who have been there. On one side, they then put the losses. What are the things that they've missed over time? You can go forward. What are the places they've been? Life maps. So if you were to make it illustrative, if you were to make a picture of it, make a road, a map, where have you been? What are the signs, the messages that you've had? You can draw little places, little houses and buildings, etc. They can draw little people who's been there at different points in their map. You can go for it.
Christine,
Yeah.
you have 1 more minute left. Just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, thank you. And a roller coaster. So where were the dips and dives? Where were things challenging and what were the highs, right? What's this ride you've been on? Okay, you can go forward and go forward one more. If you look at the tree of life, like, what are your roots, your birth family, the people who were there in your past? What's the trunk? Who supports you now? And then the leaves. What are your hopes for the future? Yeah. So I'm going to pause there. We will share, Amanda, I assume we can share out resources afterwards?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. So I'll share out some of these models afterwards, as well as an article that you can look at called the 357 model. And we'll make sure that you have some resources to connect with as well over time. And feel free to reach out, if you can go forward, Claire, to the end. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have, either to the Children's Bereavement Center, or you can reach out to me directly as well.
Thank you so much, Christine, for being here and providing so much great information. I know we are on time. I just wanted to share with everyone, if you're not familiar with the Children's Bereavement Center, we are located in South Florida. We service Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward County. However, our grief support groups are on Zoom, so it really does not matter where you live. Our groups are for ages 4 up to adulthood. So I am going to type in the chat quickly. If you or anyone would like to register in our groups, the information is in the chat. And I will pass it over quickly to our CEO, Deborah, that she has some words for us.
Christine, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. I cannot tell you how informative that was, and the partners on the call. It's so nice to see so many of your friendly faces. I haven't seen you in a while, but such an amazing presentation. This was feedback from our community that they wanted this topic, and I really can't emphasize enough how great it was. Amanda did put information in the chat about our groups. We do have in-person groups as well, starting actually Overtown Youth Center, the Children's Village in Overtown also, and we will have them throughout Broward and Palm Beach. So if you are not aware of that, please make sure you register for our newsletter. Amanda, maybe you could put that in the chat. And I also want to do a quick plug for our training. Some of you have gone through our Grief Informed training series. It is currently free for different mental health professionals, different youth serving staff throughout the state of Florida. And I really want to make sure that everyone is aware of that, because if you haven't gone through our training, it is incredible. And some of it Christine talked about, especially in the bereavement world, but I highly recommend it. We are sharing the PowerPoint, Anna, and you'll also receive a video, everyone who's registered, a recording. But thank you, Christine, again. Amanda, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you so much, Christine. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and I will be here for any questions that you may have. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.